Hello friends, this is Dr. Pritesh Singh, National Level Surgery Faculty and Prepladder's Surgery Faculty. I'm the author of best-selling titles NEET Essence, AIMS Essence, Surgery Essence and Quick Review of Surgery. These are the best-selling titles. So we are going to discuss the surgery questions of INI CET 2020. I hope you people are taking good care of yourself in this tough situation of COVID. So let's discuss the questions. So see the first question. A 45 years old female presented with 15 days history of sudden enlargement. See the history, 15 days history, and there is sudden enlargement of left breast. On examination, left breast was grossly enlarged, warm to touch with redness, right? Now it's an easy question because on image is also given and you can easily rule out the options by principle of exclusion. Now one by one, what is the history? Short history of 15 days, and simultaneously this lady is having what? The skin changes, in which there is erythema, there is redness and it is warm to touch, right? Now let's discuss the options one by one. Is it galactocele? No. Why? Because generally in galactocele there is subareolar cyst and which is solitary. The name is galactocele, so it contains milk. If this galactocele is present for long duration, sometimes there is calcification, but skin changes are not there, right? So this is ruled out. Atypical hyperplasia is histopathological diagnosis. Clear? What about fibroadenoma? Fibroadenoma, what is the age group in which fibroadenoma is seen? It is generally seen in young females and the age is 16 to 25 years. Means it is seen around puberty. Large fibroadenoma is also a rare diagnosis, but there is a similar history. There is rapid enlargement of the swelling. Okay? But skin changes are not seen in fibroadenoma. So this is also ruled out because skin changes are not seen. So what is the correct answer? It is a case of inflammatory breast cancer, which is also known as mastitis carcinomatosa. The name is mastitis carcinomatosa. Okay. So why its name is mastitis carcinomatosa? Because despite being a malignancy, it mimics inflammatory condition of breast. And what's that? Mastitis or breast abscess. And that's why you will find the skin changes. If you see the definition of inflammatory breast cancer, in the definition itself, more than 1/3 or 33% of breast skin should be involved. And what are the changes? The name is inflammatory breast cancer. So there should be inflammatory changes in the skin like erythema, like early onset of beauty orange and brownie in duration. Clear? So what is the correct answer here? The correct answer is A, that is inflammatory breast cancer. Now see the literature. What are the terms and what are the statements mentioned about these conditions? So if you see this inflammatory breast cancer, it manifests as erythema, edema, warmth of breast as a result of lymphatic obstruction. So these findings were there in the question. And generally, see the history. The history should reveal rapid onset of disease. Certain patients are coming to you within 2 to 3 weeks or within 2 to 3 months. Inflammatory breast cancer is having worse prognosis. Why? Because there is early onset of lymph node metastasis and distant metastasis. If you see the galactocele, we discussed that it is solitary subareolar cyst and generally name is galactocele. So always dates from lactation and it contains milk. If the patient is having long standing galactocele, so what happens? Its walls generally tends to calcify. So you might find calcification in the wall. And we discussed that fibroadenoma is seen in young females. So it is it's rare diagnosis, but generally it occurs around puberty. It is often rapid growing, but skin changes are not there. So for this question, the correct answer is inflammatory breast cancer. Another question, a 40 years old female felt a mass in left breast. Okay. And on examination, a mass of what was the size? 3 into 3 centimeter felt in left breast in upper outer quadrant. Simultaneously, she was having single palpable lymph node. So single palpable lymph node of 2 into 2 centimeter size on anterior border of axilla on same side. Means on the left side there is a mass in breast in upper outer quadrant, and there is a palpable lymph node. Opposite breast and axillary examinations is unremarkable. What is the next best step? Now see, any patient who is coming with a breast lump, any patient, what is the first investigation done? If you suspect malignancy, so first investigation done in a suspected case of breast cancer is mammography. Why? See, if this female is having breast cancer here, what? You know that this malignancy is there in one quadrant, but you don't know the status of other quadrants of same breast. So what you go for? Bilateral mammography. Why? Because you want to assess the other quadrants of same breast and you want to assess the contralateral breast. So first investigation done in a suspected case of breast cancer is mammography. So we will go for bilateral mammography. And if we suspect malignancy, what is the investigation of choice for diagnosis? Investigation of choice for diagnosis of breast cancer is biopsy. So we have to go for the biopsy from the breast lump. Third problem, there is palpable lymph node. So you will go for lymph node biopsy or not? You will not go. Why? Because generally palpable lymph node, we generally go for sentinel lymph node biopsy if a patient is having breast cancer. But palpable lymphadenopathy is a contraindication. Clear? So we are not going for lymph node biopsy here. Fourth, what is the role of PET scan? See, we discussed many times in our videos that in general there are two indications of PET scan irrespective of malignancies or in majority of malignancies. One, it is going to evaluate the distant metastasis or detect the distant metastasis, and it is used to detect the recurrence. So PET scan is mainly used for detecting the metastasis and recurrence. In breast cancer, what is one additional use of PET scan? That we are going to use PET scan for follow-up or for monitoring the response of therapy. In which patients? The patients who are having locally advanced breast cancer and metastatic breast cancer. Why? Because in locally advanced breast cancer there is high risk of metastasis, and in metastatic breast cancer there is high risk of recurrence. Routinely for assessment of breast cancer or for assessment of axilla per se, PET scan is not indicated. Clear? So see first literature and then we will discuss the options. So we discussed that biopsy, the other name of biopsy is true cut biopsy, also known as core cut biopsy, also known as needle biopsy. So investigation of choice for diagnosis of breast cancer is biopsy. One, bilateral mammography is done, and any patient who is having suspected breast cancer, this is the first investigation done. Now read this statement, which is very important. Evaluation of primary or axillary breast cancer disease status is not an indication for PET imaging. So what are the indications for PET imaging? So we discussed mainly it is used for detecting the metastasis, distant metastasis, then recurrence, usually in majority of malignancies, and in breast cancer for monitoring the response of therapy. In which patients? The patients who are having locally advanced and metastatic breast cancer. So these are the indications of PET scan. So in this question, we are not going to use PET scan. Now see sentinel lymph node biopsy or sentinel lymph node dissection, it is not recommended. In which cases? If a patient is having inflammatory breast cancer. Why? Because there is high risk of lymph node metastasis and more than 75% patients have lymph node metastasis at the time of presentation. If a patient is already having palpable axillary lymphadenopathy, or there is biopsy proven metastasis, or patient is having ductal carcinoma in situ without mastectomy, or if the patient is already having any kind of axilla surgery. So in these cases, sentinel lymph node biopsy is not recommended. Okay, so now let's see the question again. So what is the next best step in this patient? Okay, so first we go for what? Mammography. This is the first investigation done, and investigation of choice for diagnosis, we have to go for biopsy from the breast lump. Ultrasound guided biopsy of lymph node, not done, and in this case PET scan is not done. Clear? So 1 and 3 are correct. So what is the correct answer for this question? The correct answer for this question is B. Now see this question, easy question. 45 years old female presented with rapid weight gain, loss of appetite and lassitude. Now see here, there is loss of appetite, despite of that what? There is weight gain, and there is lassitude, lack of energy. So generally these are the findings suggestive of hypothyroidism. What happens in hyperthyroidism? There is increased appetite but there is weight loss. Now see, investigations show increased TSH. So there is increased TSH and there is decreased T4. So this is also finding suggestive of what? Hypothyroidism. And the clinical features are also suggestive of hypothyroidism. And what is the most common cause of hypothyroidism worldwide, especially in adults? It's Hashimoto's thyroiditis. So what is the correct answer? A, that is Hashimoto's thyroiditis. Graves' disease is the most common cause of hyperthyroidism worldwide, so it's ruled out. Hyperparathyroidism, not related to thyroid, and pituitary tumor. So these are incorrect. So the correct answer for this question is A, that is Hashimoto's thyroiditis. And Hashimoto's thyroiditis is one of the most frequently asked topic in AIIMS, in NEET. So you have to remember, and this topic is asked in medicine, in surgery, in pathology. Now see this question. Actually this question was asked in AIIMS GI surgery, super specialty. So it's an indirect repeat. We discussed this topic many times in our videos. So you see the question. 40 years old female patient presented with pain in right upper quadrant on 5th post-operative day following laparoscopic cholecystectomy. So after laparoscopic cholecystectomy, when the patient was discharged, on 5th day she started having pain in right upper quadrant. One of the common manifestation of bile leak. Now see, patient was icteric and on ultrasound 5 into 5 centimeter collection was present in Morrison pouch. Whenever we suspect bile leak, what is the first investigation? Generally, we send the patient for ultrasound. Okay, and we are going to detect whether there is collection of bile, and that is known as biloma. Bile leak was suspected. Which of the following, here what is the catch? Which of the following is most sensitive investigation? Okay, so we are going to discuss this in detail because this is important. Now see the problem. This is a patient. Okay, in this patient we are going to perform what? Laparoscopic cholecystectomy. So we are going to apply 2 clips on cystic duct side, 1 clip towards gallbladder side, and we are going to remove the gallbladder. What is the most commonly injured part of bile duct? It's the common hepatic duct. Okay, so sometimes there is injury where here, right, and from this injury bile leak starts. Now what is the problem? Whenever there is bile duct injury, bile leak starts. The problem is that bile ducts are not dilated, right? So we can detect the biloma collection by ultrasound, we can detect it by CT, and we can evaluate the anatomy of bile duct by ERCP or MRCP also. But what is the problem? Since bile duct is not dilated, the exact site of bile leak might be missed on these radiological investigations. What is the role of ERCP, especially in such patients? Imagine that there is bile duct injury leading to bile leak and patient is having obstruction also, distal obstruction in the form of some stone, in the form of some spasm. So if we want some kind of intervention, why? Because we have to relieve the obstruction. ERCP is a better investigation. But what is the most sensitive investigation for detecting the bile leak? It's the HIDA scan. HIDA scan, suppose other investigations are going to miss the site of bile leak, HIDA scan will detect. So the most sensitive investigation for detecting the bile leak is HIDA scan. Okay, now see what is written in Blumgart. Blumgart is considered Bible of hepatobiliary pancreatic surgery. So it's written, diagnosis of bile leak can be made by non-invasive imaging techniques such as ultrasound, CT, MRI means MRCP. But because intrahepatic bile ducts are not dilated, bile leak may not be evident on imaging. right? And if these above mentioned investigations are not helpful, what? HIDA scan useful for diagnosis when other imaging modalities are inconclusive. And we discussed in which case we go for ERCP. ERCP is usually reserved for the cases where therapeutic intervention is anticipated, means we are supposed to insert a stent, or if there is a stone we are supposed to remove the stone, then we go for ERCP. Now see what is written in Schwartz. The site of bile leak can be confirmed non-invasively with HIDA scan, right? So we may detect the biloma by ultrasound CT, but best investigation or most sensitive investigation for detecting bile leak is HIDA scan. Clear? So correct answer for this question is C, that's HIDA scan. So another question related to bile duct injury. According to Strasbourg classification, leak from aberrant right sectoral duct injury occurs in, right? So there are two important classifications which are frequently asked. One is Bismuth and second is Strasbourg. So we are going to discuss both and then we will discuss the question. Now see the simple anatomy. This is the liver, this is the gallbladder, this is the bile duct, and we discussed what is the most commonly injured part of bile duct, the part which is going to form a boundary of Galler's triangle, and that's what this common hepatic duct. This is most commonly injured, and the most common, if we are going to consider laparoscopic cholecystectomy and open cholecystectomy, obviously which one is mainly responsible for bile duct injury? Bile duct injury is more common in lap cholecystectomy. Clear? Now whenever there is injury to this part of common hepatic duct, so you will see this common hepatic duct stump is more than 2 centimeters, right? So this is known as type 1. So according to Bismuth classification of biliary strictures, when the common hepatic duct stump is more than 2 centimeter, it is type 1. Now suppose injury is here, so here is the stricture. In this case, common hepatic duct stump will be less than 2 centimeter and the stricture is mid, so this is type 2. Suppose the stricture is here, so hilar stricture with intact confluence, so this is type 3. And if stricture is here, so hilar stricture with destroyed confluence. Confluence means where this right hepatic duct and left hepatic duct is going to join. So hilar stricture with intact confluence is type 3 and hilar stricture with destroyed confluence, that's type 4, right? And since the confluence is destroyed, you will notice that right hepatic duct and left hepatic duct are separated. Now what is type 5? To understand type 5, you have to understand important aspects of anatomy. See, so this is the liver, this is the right hepatic duct, this is the left hepatic duct. Both of these are going to join form common hepatic duct. Common hepatic duct joins with cystic duct form CBD. Okay. Now this right hepatic duct, there are two ducts. One is anterior sectoral duct and one is posterior sectoral duct. You must be knowing that in right lobe of liver there are two sectors, right anterior sector and right posterior sector. In right anterior sector there are two segments, 5 and 8, and in right posterior sector there are two segments, 6 and 7. So there are two sectoral ducts. Anterior sectoral duct and posterior sectoral duct joins together and form right hepatic duct. This is the normal anatomy. Sometimes what's the problem? This anterior sectoral duct, yes, this is aberrant. Aberrant means abnormal origin or abnormal insertion, and in that case sometimes this aberrant right sectoral duct is going to attach to cystic duct or common hepatic duct, and because of this it is very prone to get injured during surgery. Now imagine if this is injured during surgery, there is stricture of aberrant right sectoral duct, and if there is stricture of aberrant right sectoral duct, this is type 5. Doesn't matter in this case there is stricture of common hepatic duct or not. So these are type 1 to type 5. So 5 types of Bismuth classification. So this is Bismuth classification of bile duct stricture. What's the problem with this classification? This classification is not going to give any idea about bile leak, whether there was any kind of vascular injury, there was bile leak, So there is a better classification than bismuth, and the name of that classification is Strasberg classification. So again, it's very easy to understand Strasberg classification. We perform lab cholecystectomy. Clear? This is the gallbladder. Okay. So after performing lab cholecystectomy, we are going to apply two clips towards cystic duct side, one clip towards gallbladder side, and the final diagram would be something like this. This is liver, this is gallbladder. Okay. Sometimes during lab cholecystectomy, a stone slips into CVD, and because of that, there is increased pressure in the CVD. And what happens? The clips are going to get dislodged. So if the clip is dislodged, there will be leak from cystic duct stump. This is type A. And there is small duct known as subvesical duct of Lashka. So sometimes there is injury, or we are going to perform the transaction of this subvesical duct of Lashka. So this is also included in type A. What is type B? We discussed that there is this kind of duct, clear? And there is aberrant right sectoral duct. So whenever we are going to perform the transaction with occlusion of aberrant right sectoral duct, this is type B. And if there is transaction without occlusion, and that is type C. What is type D? There is lateral injury to common hepatic duct. And what is type E? It's E1 to E5 bismuth classification. So see again, cystic duct stump leak or leak from subvesical duct of Lashka, that is type A. In type B, there is transaction with occlusion of aberrant right sectoral duct, and in type C, there is transaction without occlusion. Type D, there is injury to lateral wall, and type E is E1 to E5 bismuth classification. So what is E1? When the common hepatic duct stump is more than 2 cm, E2 less than 2 cm, E3 hilar stricture with intact confluence, E4 hilar stricture with destroyed confluence, and E5 stricture involving aberrant right sectoral duct with or without stricture of common hepatic duct. Clear? So see the question. According to Strasberg classification, leak from aberrant right sectoral duct injury occurs in, and that is type C. There is one indirect question. Out of 5 types A, B, C, D, E, in which type generally you will not find any leak in postoperative period, and that's type B. Why? Because there is occlusion of aberrant right sectoral duct. So if there is occlusion of aberrant right sectoral duct, there is no leak in postoperative period, and that's why it's very difficult to detect type B. Clear? So for this question, the correct answer is C, and that is type C. Again, this is an easy question, and you can solve this question by principle of exclusion, right? See, 40 years old female. So what is the age of this patient? 40 years. Now see, this age points towards a benign etiology or malignant. So benign etiology. If the age of patient is 60, we should think in terms of malignancy. So 40 years old female, history of progressive dysphagia. Progressive dysphagia generally suggest malignancy. Okay. And the third clue, that there is dysphagia for both solids and liquids. So see, if there is dysphagia to both solids and liquids, or dysphagia more to liquids, this points towards achalasia cardia. Okay, so there is dysphagia to both liquids and solids, right, for the last 8 months. And what is the BMI? Body mass index 18.5. So this patient is having malnutrition, means patient is having weight loss, right? What is the cause of weight loss? Weight loss is a feature of malignancy also, and the weight loss is feature of achalasia cardia also, right? The barium swallow image is given below. So if you see the barium findings, this patient is having weight loss also. And if you see this barium finding, this is bird beak. So there is bird beak appearance. There were 2 barium swallow images, and this is what? Rat tail. And here you can see there is dilated esophagus. So all these are pointing towards achalasia cardia. You must be knowing what happens in achalasia cardia. In achalasia cardia, there is absence of LES relaxation. So whatever patient is going to eat, everything is going to collect in esophagus only. So over a period of time, what happens? There is dilatation of esophagus, right? It's a motility disorder. Achalasia cardia is the most common motility disorder of esophagus. And we discussed many times in our videos that investigation of choice for diagnosis of motility disorder is manometry. Clear? So we will go for manometry because we are going to suspect what? This is a clear-cut case of achalasia cardia. Pointers, age 40 years, dysphagia, progressive dysphagia for both liquids and solid. There is weight loss, bird beak appearance, rat tail appearance. So we have to go for manometry. So we have to go for high resolution manometry. Is there any role of CT for diagnosis? No. PET scan. Why? Because we perform CT or PET scan in cases of malignancy. PET scan for distant metastasis and CT if the locally advanced malignancy is there. Now, 24 hours pH monitoring. 24 hours pH monitoring is performed for which patients? The patients who are having GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease. So clinical scenario is not suggesting that patient is having gastroesophageal reflux disease. Whether we will perform endoscopy or not, let me tell you. Any patient who is having dysphagia, doesn't matter, barium swallow is pointing towards motility disorder, we have to go for endoscopy. So endoscopy should be done in all patients who are having dysphagia, even if the barium swallow findings are suggestive of motility disorder. Clear? So what is the correct answer for this question? It's B. Okay, let's see what's written in literature. So in achalasia cardia, barium radiology may show holdup in distal esophagus, abnormal contractions in esophageal body, and tapering structure in distal esophagus, described as bird beak. And if you are going to perform the endoscopy in achalasia cardia, what happens? There is absence of LES relaxation. So you will notice that there is tight cardia, and whatever the food stuff patient has taken, you will notice all those food stuff in the esophagus. So on endoscopy, there is tight cardia and the food residue in esophagus. How we are going to make the diagnosis? Final diagnosis is made by high resolution manometry. So investigation of choice for diagnosis is manometry. Now see, diagnosis of esophageal cancer is almost always made by endoscopic biopsy. So we go for endoscopy and perform the biopsy. Endoscopy should be performed in any patient with dysphagia. You have to remember this statement. Any patient with dysphagia, even if barium esophagogram is suggestive of a motility disorder. Clear? So what we will go for in this case, since patient is having dysphagia, we have to go for endoscopy, and investigation of choice for diagnosis of achalasia cardia is manometry. So we go for high resolution manometry. So correct answer for this question is B, upper GI endoscopy plus high resolution manometry. So another commonly repeated questions, this is one of the most commonly asked topic in the exam in both NEET and AIIMS. See, which of the following are true about congenital hypertrophic pyloric stenosis? You know, the name of congenital hypertrophic pyloric stenosis is changed. Now it's infantile hypertrophic pyloric stenosis. Why? Because this is a acquired condition. Okay. What's the problem in this case? So here you can see there is hypertrophy of circular muscle fibers near pylorus, and because of that, what, there is obstruction. And because of this obstruction, what happens in this baby? Just after breastfeeding, there is vomiting. What kind of vomiting if here is the obstruction? Yes, there are multiple episodes of non-bilious vomiting. Clear? And in this vomitus, what patient is going to lose apart from breast milk? You know what else? In the stomach, there is mucus which contains potassium, and there is acid which contains H plus and Cl minus. So if there are multiple episodes of vomiting, there is loss of potassium, and that is hypokalemia. There is loss of chloride, so there is hypochloremia, and there is loss of H plus, so there is metabolic alkalosis. So this patient is going to develop hypokalemia, hypochloremia, metabolic alkalosis. right? Since there is obstruction, you will notice on examination that there are visible peristalsis. So you notice visible peristalsis, and what's the direction of this visible peristalsis? If you see the abdomen, this is the abdomen. So this is the direction of peristalsis. Can you see? It starts from proximal part, go to distal part of stomach, means from left, means from left to right. And there is a palpable mass or olive. Where we are going to find that mass or olive? In epigastrium or sometimes in right hypochondrium. So there is palpable mass or olive. Clear? So see the options. Which of the following are true about congenital hypertrophic pyloric stenosis? Right to left peristalsis? No, there is left to right peristalsis. Palpable abdominal mass? Yes, it is palpable in epigastrium or right hypochondrium. There is bilious vomiting? No, there is non-bilious vomiting. Clear? And hypochloremic, hypokalemic metabolic alkalosis. So second is correct, 4 is correct. So second and 4. So correct answer for this question is B. So see the statements written about hypertrophic pyloric stenosis in Sebastian and Bailey. There is non-bilious projectile vomiting. There is loss of hydrochloric acid with onset of hypokalemia, hypochloremia, metabolic alkalosis, and there is dehydration. Hypertrophic pyloric stenosis can be diagnosed clinically also. How? Because whenever we are giving test feed to the baby, there is visible gastric peristalsis. And what is the direction? From left to right. Right? And in a relaxed baby, there is a pyloric tumor or palpable mass or olive in right upper quadrant. Clear? Now see this question. Which of the following are used in the management of upper GI bleeding? Okay, one by one see. So if you see this first option, what is the name of this tube? Here you are going to notice that there are two balloons. How many balloons? There are two balloons. And how many lumens? 1, 2, 3. So there are two balloons and there are three lumens. And what is the name of this tube? This is Sengsteken-Blakemore tube. SB tube. So this is Sengsteken-Blakemore tube. Now see this one. If you see this option B, again there are two balloons. But how many lumens? You can see there are 4 lumens. 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is Minnesota tube. In Minnesota tube, there are 2 lumen for 2 balloons. And there are 2 other lumens. One is gastric suction lumen and second is esophageal suction lumen. In Sengsteken-Blakemore tube, there are 2 lumens for 2 balloons, but there is only one lumen, and which is the gastric suction lumen. So in Minnesota tube, there are 2 balloons and there are 4 lumens, right? If Minnesota tube is available, it is preferred over Sengsteken-Blakemore tube. Why? Because it can perform the channel for aspiration above the balloon and below the balloon. So both Sengsteken-Blakemore tube as well as Minnesota tube, these are used for controlling bleeding from varices. So this is known as esophagogastric tamponade therapy. What's the name? Esophagogastric tamponade therapy. So this is going to control the bleeding. Generally, what is the use? Imagine if a patient is there and patient is brought to a primary setup where endoscopic facility is not there. After resuscitating the patient, to control the bleeding, we insert these tubes and we transfer the patient to higher center. Or suppose endoscopic facility is available, but still what some patient is there whose endoscopy is being performed. So if we are waiting for definitive treatment, so during that period, means after resuscitation and before performing definitive treatment, if there is some time, we have to insert this tube to control the bleeding. Third option, sometimes we perform endoscopy and endoscopy is not going to control the bleeding. In that case also, these tubes are used for controlling the bleeding. Okay. Now see the C option and D option. If you see C and D option, both of these are endoscopes. Endoscopes. Clear? So you saw that option A, this is Sengsteken-Blakemore tube. This one is Minnesota tube, and C and D are endoscopes. Okay, so for before discussing this question, let's see how we are going to manage the patients of varicose bleeding. So in patients of varicose bleeding, since there is massive blood loss, what happens, most of the patients are in the state of hypotension or shock. Clear? And their stomach is also full. So what happens, these patients are having risk of aspiration. So when the patient is brought to the emergency, after taking care of airway breathing circulation, we perform the resuscitation. Our goal of hemoglobin should be 8, and we have to maintain how much blood pressure, 100, systolic blood pressure 100. So we have to perform the resuscitation. After that, we have to control the bleeding by pharmacotherapy. So we give drugs. One is octreotide and second is terlipressin or vasopressin. Which one is preferred? The drug of choice is octreotide. The second option or second line agent is terlipressin. So you control the bleeding. We perform what? The gastric lavage so that stomach is clear, and then we send the patient for upper GI endoscopy. First investigation done in a case of upper GI bleeding, it's endoscopy. On endoscopy, you are going to perform the intervention. So we have to ligate the varices, that is known as endoscopic varicose ligation or band ligation, or we go for sclerotherapy, that is known as endoscopic sclerotherapy. Which one is preferred? Endoscopic varicose ligation is preferred over sclerotherapy. Why? Because in sclerotherapy there is increased risk of complication. Which one? Esophageal perforation, right? Whenever bleeding stops, generally what we do, we continue the octreotide for 3 to 5 days. We have to give antibiotics for 7 days, means 1 week. And generally patients are having multiple varices, so we have to go for varicose eradication. That's why repeated endoscopic banding is done every 10 to 14 days, right? What is the problem? Sometimes bleeding is not stopped. Sometimes bleeding is not stopped even after endoscopy. In that case, we have to go for esophagogastric tamponade therapy. So we have to control the bleeding by pressure, by inflating the balloon in esophageal lumen and gastric lumen. And the other options are, we have TIPS, surgical shunt. So this is how we are going to manage the patients. These are the 3 tubes which are used for esophagogastric tamponade therapy. Okay, see how we are going to differentiate the tubes. If you see the C option, there is only one balloon, and that is gastric balloon. Single balloon, and how many lumens? 1, 2, 3. So there is single balloon, and there are 3 lumens, and the balloon is in the stomach, gastric balloon. So this is known as Linton Necklace tube. What's the name? This was asked in NEET and DNB. Linton Necklace tube. Clear? And since there is a single balloon, gastric balloon, so this is used for isolated gastric varices, right? Now what are these lumens? One is for inflating the balloon, one is used as gastric suction lumen, and one is used as esophageal suction lumen. Clear? So gastric suction lumen, esophageal suction lumen, and there is a single balloon used for isolated gastric varices. Now see A and B, these two. In both there are 2 balloons, gastric and esophageal balloons. So 2 balloons. But if you see A, there are 3 lumens. The 2 lumens are for the 2 balloons. The third lumen is gastric suction lumen. Be careful what happens here. There is no esophageal suction lumen. So there are 2 balloons and there are 3 lumens. If you see this one, there are 2 balloons and there are 4 lumens. 2 lumens are for the balloons, and the 2 other lumens, one is for esophagus and one is for stomach. What? These are gastric and esophageal suction lumens. So what is the advantage? You can perform the suction of contents above as well as below the balloon. So this A is Sengstaken. This is Sengstaken Blakemore tube. This was asked many times in exams as image based question. And this is known as Minnesota tube. right? Suppose if we have to choose one tube if both are available, Sengstaken Blakemore tube and Minnesota. So which one is preferred? Minnesota is preferred. Why? Because we can perform the aspiration both above and below the balloon. Clear? So all these are used as tubes in controlling the variceal bleeding. So these are the tubes used for esophagogastric tamponade therapy. Clear? So let's see the question again. Which of the following are used in management of upper GI bleeding? Okay, so Sengstaken Blakemore tube is also used, Minnesota tube is also used, C and D. These endoscopes are also used. So what is the correct answer for this question? A, B, C, D. So the correct answer is D. Now see this question. This question was asked for the first time. Tillot's triad was asked many times. Tillot's sign, this question was asked for the first time. See, both Tillot's triad as well as Tillot's sign, these are related to a cyst. And what's the name of that cyst? Mesenteric cyst. Clear? What is the most common type of mesenteric cyst? It is chylolymphatic. And the second most common type is enterogenous. Okay, let's first discuss the cyst and then we will discuss these options. Now see the location of cyst. This is the line of attachment of mesentery. Okay, and this is the umbilicus, right? So generally the cyst is in relation to line of attachment of mesentery and it moves perpendicular to the attachment of mesentery. Imagine if this is the umbilicus, so the cyst is located here. So what is the location of swelling? It is periumbilical. So there is soft fluctuant swelling in periumbilical region. The cyst contains liquid. Okay, chylolymphatics. So in chylolymphatics there is lymph, and in enterogenous cyst there is mucus. So since the cyst contains liquid and around the cyst there is bowel, if we perform the percussion, you will notice that cyst is dull, but there is a zone of resonance around the swelling. So what? There is soft fluctuant swelling in periumbilical region moving perpendicular to the attachment of mesentery and zone of resonance around the swelling. This is known as Tillot's triad. And out of this Tillot's triad, what is Tillot's sign? When the swelling moves perpendicular to the attachment of mesentery or in a plane right angle to the attachment of mesentery, and this is known as what? Tillot's sign. Clear? Now see the question. Which of the following is true about Tillot's sign? Mass felt in periumbilical region. Yes, it is seen in mesenteric cyst, but this is not the Tillot's sign. Fluctuation is positive. Yes, in mesenteric cyst fluctuation is positive, but this is also not the Tillot's sign. Move perpendicular to the line of attachment of mesentery means line joining anterior abdomen to mid pelvic region. This is Tillot's sign. Mesenteric cyst is not brilliantly transilluminant, so this is incorrect. So for this question, what is the correct answer? It is C. So this is Tillot's sign. This image based question is favorite question of AIIMS people, NEET people, because this question is asked almost every year. Image based question showing pneumoperitoneum suggestive of perforation peritonitis. So one clue, the chest x-ray itself says that it is case of perforation peritonitis. Indirectly there are evidences. Now see the evidences. 60 years old male, known case of coronary artery disease. You must be knowing that patients are taking high dose of aspirin, taking NSAIDs. So because of this aspirin or this NSAID, there is NSAID induced ulcer. So it's one of the type of peptic ulcer. So this is one of the common presentations. Presented or brought to the emergency with pain abdomen. On examination, tenderness is present all over abdomen and the BP of 90/60. Chest x-ray is given below and you can see what? The gas under diaphragm, right dome of diaphragm. So what? This is perforation peritonitis because you can see pneumoperitoneum. What is the next step of management? See, you have seen in surgery emergency that if the patients are there of perforation peritonitis, so what happens? These patients are having pain all over abdomen, tenderness all over abdomen. At the time of presentation, what happens? There is extravasation of fluid into the peritoneal cavity. So these patients have shock. So when these patients are brought to emergency, first we resuscitate the patient. So we give IV fluids, right? Start resuscitating. Okay, we have to insert Ryle's tube and Foley's catheter. We have to give analgesics. We have to give analgesics and antibiotics. Clear? When the patient is resuscitated means when there is adequate tissue perfusion, means the urine output is 1 ml per minute, then only we send the patient for investigations, right? And on investigation, what happens if there is pneumoperitoneum? Now we take the patient for laparotomy, exploratory laparotomy. So before resuscitating the patient, generally we avoid sending patient anywhere because this patient is having peritonitis and shock. So what is the first step? We have to resuscitate the patient, so we give IV fluids, IV antibiotics, and then we take the patient for laparotomy. So what is the next step of management? IV fluids and exploratory laparotomy, correct? Observation and conservative management, no, there is no role. Ultrasound abdomen, generally not advised. In emergency laparotomy, without resuscitation, laparotomy is not done. So correct answer for this question is A. Now see this question. A 40 years old patient with previous history of MI, myocardial infarction, presented to emergency with history of multiple episodes of vomiting. So first, patient is having previous history of myocardial infarction and there are multiple episodes of vomiting. There is pain abdomen and blood in stools, right? On examination, see the blood pressure 90/60. So patient is having what? Hypotension. Pulse rate 112 per minute. So vitals are unstable. Patient is having tachycardia. And here is the clue. Pulse were irregular. So you must be knowing that irregular pulse, this is seen in atrial fibrillation. So this patient is having atrial fibrillation, and a patient of atrial fibrillation who is having severe abdominal pain, multiple episodes of vomiting, blood in stools and unstable vitals. But problem, see here, abdomen was soft, non-distended and bowel sounds were absent. It means what you can see here, that symptoms are out of proportion of signs. Means patient is having severe abdominal pain, patient is having blood in stool, patient is having multiple episodes of vomiting. Despite of that, abdomen is soft and non-distended. So what is the most probable diagnosis? It is very easy to crack this question because so many findings are suggestive of the diagnosis. First, severe abdominal pain, sudden onset of severe abdominal pain in patients of atrial fibrillation or atherosclerosis suggests the diagnosis of acute mesenteric ischemia. Why? Because in atherosclerosis there is formation of emboli, and in atrial fibrillation also there is formation of emboli. These emboli are going to obstruct the branch of superior mesenteric artery, which is going to supply the midgut, and that leads to acute mesenteric ischemia. So first clue, the patient should be having arrhythmia, atrial fibrillation or atherosclerosis. Second clue, the symptoms should be out of proportion of signs. Clear? Now let's see the options. Ruptured aortic aneurysm. See, in aortic aneurysm, what? There is abdominal pain or back pain. So there is abdominal pain or back pain. There is hypotension plus there is pulsatile abdominal mass. Clear? So ruptured aortic aneurysm is characterized by abdominal pain or back pain plus hypotension plus pulsatile abdominal mass. And here you can't see what? Pulsatile abdominal mass. Second, generally there is no vomiting in ruptured aortic aneurysm. Clear? So this is ruled out. Peptic ulcer perforation we discussed, it leads to perforation peritonitis, and because of peritonitis there is pain all over abdomen and tenderness all over abdomen. There is guarding, there is rigidity. These findings are not there. Clear? So this is ruled out. Generally in severe acute pancreatitis, what? There is no relation of the pulses, and even in severe acute pancreatitis, what happens? The tenderness is present in abdomen. Clear? So this is also ruled out. So correct answer for this question is what? Acute mesenteric ischemia. Clear? Now see what's written in the books related to acute mesenteric ischemia. So severe abdominal pain out of proportion to the degree of tenderness on examination is hallmark of acute mesenteric ischemia, regardless of the pathophysiologic mechanism, right? And generally, in the patients of acute mesenteric ischemia, you will notice that physical findings are characteristically absent in early phase of the disease. That's why if there is delay in diagnosis in acute mesenteric ischemia, what the results are catastrophic, because it will lead to gangrene of the midgut. And after gangrene of the midgut, what it is very difficult to save the patient, because whenever you are going to resect almost whole midgut, patient will develop short bowel syndrome. That's why early diagnosis is the key, right? Passage of bloody stool, this is not seen in early stage of the acute mesenteric ischemia. Generally what happens, whenever there is occlusion of superior mesenteric artery, so later patient is going to develop bowel infarction, then patient develops distension, peritonitis and bloody stools, right? Now see what's written in the Bailey related to acute mesenteric ischemia, that sudden onset of severe abdominal pain in patient with atrial fibrillation or atherosclerosis. Clear? So this is highly suggestive of what? Acute mesenteric ischemia. And the other symptoms which are seen in this condition is persistent vomiting. Generally defecation occurs early, and what happens, there is ischemia of the bowel, so there is passage of altered blood or blood in the stools. Clear? So these are the findings which are suggestive of acute mesenteric ischemia. So in the question, patient was having previous history of MI, patient is having pulses which is irregular, suggestive of atrial fibrillation, and the symptoms are out of proportion of signs. So correct answer for this question is acute mesenteric ischemia. This is an easy question and this was asked many times in AIIMS and NEET. See the question, which of the following is correct about Peutz-Jeghers syndrome? Okay, so what happens in Peutz-Jeghers syndrome? You must be knowing that Peutz-Jeghers syndrome, there is presence of multiple hematomatous polyps. So here you can see multiple hypermelanotic macules involving lips. It also involves buccal mucosa. It is because of which mutation? LKB1 or STK11. So the gene is LKB1 or STK11 and it is located on chromosome number 19. Peutz-Jeghers syndrome is autosomal dominant condition. So this is autosomal dominant condition, and what happens in this case, there are two characteristic histological features. One is arborizing pattern or arborization, and the second is pseudo invasion. Clear? Arborization and pseudo invasion, right? So see the options. Congenital hypertrophy of retinal pigment epithelium is most common extraintestinal manifestation. This is wrong. Why? You must be knowing, we discussed many times in the videos, that CHRPE, congenital hypertrophied retinal pigment epithelium, this is the classical finding seen in Gardner syndrome. It is seen in which condition? Gardner's syndrome. Clear? And you must be knowing that this Gardner syndrome is autosomal dominant condition and it's a variant of FAP. FAP means familial adenomatous polyposis. Clear? So first option is incorrect. Second option, arborizing pattern or arborization. Yes, it is seen in Peutz-Jeghers syndrome. STK11 mutation. Yes, it is seen. This is autosomal dominant and there is presence of multiple gastrointestinal polyps. What kind of? Hematomatous polyps. So this is also correct. So 2, 3 and 5 are correct. So what is the correct answer for this question? The correct answer for this question is B. So see the important points related to Peutz-Jeghers syndrome. It is autosomal dominant disease and it is characterized by hypermelanotic macules involving mouth, lips, buccal mucosa. Multiple hematomatous polyps are present and it is generally present in small bowel. So in small intestine, what is the most common site? It is the jejunum. This is seen in jejunum. Okay. What are the pathological or histological characteristics? One is arborization and Second is pseudo invasion. What happens? There is presence of smooth muscle intermixed with lamina propria. So this is not the true invasion, it appears like invasion. So what? This is pseudo invasion. Clear? And it is caused by mutation of LKB1 or STK11 gene located on chromosome number 19. Okay, relatively new question. In a patient, metastasis was found in the liver, right? So liver metastasis, what is the most common primary for liver metastasis? The most common primary for liver metastasis is colorectal cancer, followed by carcinoma lung. Clear? Colorectal cancer is also adenocarcinoma, and generally carcinoma lung, especially the adenocarcinoma, what happens? It is going to metastasize to liver. Okay. Now it was on biopsy, it was found to be an adenocarcinoma. Okay. It is cytokeratin 20 positive and cytokeratin 7 negative. Clear? Now, if you see this combination, this kind of combination is only seen in colorectal cancer, colorectal carcinoma, that is adenocarcinoma, and Merkel cell carcinoma, which is cytokeratin 20 positive and cytokeratin 7 negative. Opposite means cytokeratin 7 positive and cytokeratin 20 negative. This combination is seen in many adenocarcinomas, including lung, breast, ovarian, pancreatic adenocarcinoma. So if you see in breast, in pancreatic adenocarcinoma, in lung cancer, what? All these three are cytokeratin 7 positive, cytokeratin 20 negative. This colon cancer is cytokeratin 20 positive and cytokeratin 7 negative. Clear? So what is the correct answer for this question? It's B. Let's see the important points related to cytokeratins. Now see the first statement. Majority of lung, breast, gastric and ovarian adenocarcinomas show cytokeratin 7 positive, cytokeratin 20 negative immunophenotype. What you are supposed to remember, cytokeratin 7 negative and 20 positive immunoprofile is highly specific for colorectal origin of adenocarcinoma, right? So you have to remember that cytokeratin 20 positive, cytokeratin 7 negative immunoprofile is highly specific for colorectal cancer. Okay, so see one important table related to cytokeratin 7 and 20. See, cytokeratin 7 and 20 both are positive in gastric adenocarcinoma, pancreatic, ovarian and transitional cell carcinoma. This one is important. Cytokeratin 7 positive and 20 negative. Generally it is seen in small, non-small cell carcinoma of lung, small cell carcinoma of lung, breast carcinoma, gastric, pancreatic adenocarcinoma. Okay. And here you will notice that cytokeratin 7 negative, 20 positive, it is highly specific for colorectal adenocarcinoma. Simultaneously there is another one, Merkel cell carcinoma. Clear? So these two are important, you have to remember. This was a new question asked for the first time. According to European Hernia Society, M3 type of hernia. So in incisional hernia, according to European Hernia Society, it is divided into two types, medial and lateral, right? So first see the classification, then we will discuss the question. So this is European Hernia Society classification for incisional hernia. Clear? And it is further divided into medial and lateral. The medial hernias are divided from M1 to M5 and the lateral are divided from L1 to L4. So what is M1? Here you can see M1 is subxiphoidal. So this is subxiphoidal. Below xiphoid process there is epigastrium. So this is epigastric. Then around umbilicus, umbilical. Then infraumbilical and then suprapubic. Clear? So these are the 5 types. Right? Now how to remember? The mnemonic is see you in summer. Okay, so S means subxiphoidal, E means epigastric, U means umbilical, IN means infraumbilical, and SU means suprapubic. So these are the 5 types. So what is M3? This is the umbilical incisional hernia. Clear? Now coming to the lateral types, it is divided into L1 to L4. L1 is subcostal, L2 is flank, L3 is iliac. Clear? And when it becomes lumbar, this is L4. Clear? So this is European Hernia Society classification. So what is M3 type? The M3 type is umbilical. So correct answer for this question is C. Now this question is also very important. Triangle of doom was asked many times in AIIMS, but for the first time, for the last 5 years, for the first time they are asked this myopectineal orifice. So let's first see what is triangle of doom and what is myopectineal orifice, and then we will solve this question. So this is triangle of doom. Now what are the boundaries? Medially there is vas deferens or ductus deferens. Laterally there is gonadal vessels. Apex is formed by deep ring and the base by the peritoneal edge. Okay. So beneath the peritoneal edge, what external iliac vessels are hidden, right? So what is the content? Iliac vessels. Okay. Now why it is known as triangle of doom? If during laparoscopic hernia repair, if surgeon is not aware that external iliac vessels are located in the triangle of doom beneath peritoneal edge and surgeon is performing sharp dissection. So if surgeon is performing sharp dissection in this triangle, what will happen? There is injury to these major vessels and it will lead to massive bleeding which can cause the death. So what are the boundaries? Medially, vas deferens or ductus deferens, laterally gonadal vessels, apex by deep ring and base by the peritoneal edge. Okay. See what is myopectineal orifice. So here, this is the myopectineal orifice. Clear? So here you can see boundaries. If this is the myopectineal orifice, what is medial? So medially you can see that there is rectus abdominis and rectus sheath. What is lateral? So here there is iliopsoas muscle, which is the lateral boundary. Superiorly, so here you can see superiorly, these are the arching fibers of internal oblique and transversus abdominis. So this is what conjoint and tendon. And inferiorly, what there is Cooper's ligament. So inferiorly there is Cooper's ligament. So medially rectus abdominis, rectus sheath, laterally iliopsoas, superiorly arching fibers of internal oblique and transversus abdominis, that is conjoint and tendon. Inferiorly there is Cooper's ligament. Now see, one structure which is going to cross this myopectineal orifice diagonally. So can you tell me what is the name of this structure? The structure which is crossing this myopectineal orifice diagonally, and this is what? Inguinal ligament. So the name of this ligament, inguinal ligament. So this is myopectineal orifice of Frouchard. So now let's see the question. Which of the following statements are correct about boundaries of triangle of doom and myopectineal orifice? So medially vas deferens, laterally gonadal vessels in triangle of doom. This is correct. Medially gonadal vessels, laterally vas deferens. This is incorrect. Rectus is medial to myopectineal orifice. We saw that rectus is medial, iliopsoas is lateral boundary. This is correct. And iliopsoas is the lateral boundary of myopectineal orifice. So 1 is correct, 3 is correct, 4 is correct. Right? So what is the correct answer for this question? It is C. This is straightforward, easy question. You can easily solve this question by using principle of exclusion. Okay. 10 years old female presented with history of continuous dribbling of urine since birth with normal urine voiding. So she is having normal urine voiding, means whenever her bladder is full, she is going to pass urine, and simultaneously there is continuous dribbling of urine. It means this patient must be having ectopic ureter, right? What is the most probable diagnosis? Let's rule out the options. In posterior urethral valve, there is urinary retention. Why? Because there is obstruction caused by valve present in posterior urethra. Where exactly? At or just below verumontanum. Posterior urethral valve is exclusively an abnormality of males. Exclusively. Uretrocele, this is more common in females. But in uretrocele also, what happens? There is obstruction to the urine flow. So these patients have hydronephrosis, right? Dribbling of urine is seen if the ureter is ectopic. Sometimes ectopic ureter is having uretrocele. Vesicoureteric reflux, dribbling of urine is not seen. So correct answer is C, ectopic ureteric orifice. Now what is this? See, generally this ectopic ureteric orifice is associated with duplication of ureter. What is duplication of ureter? So in duplication of ureter, there are two ureters. One is known as incomplete duplication and second is known as complete duplication. So here you can see on the right side, two ureters are fused together before draining into bladder. This is incomplete duplication or bifid ureter. If you see this left side here, this is upper pole ureter. And if you follow this upper pole ureter, can you see this upper pole ureter is not draining into bladder. It is draining into urethra. Now where exactly? If it's a male patient, it is going to open into prostatic urethra, and you know prostatic urethra is proximal to external urinary sphincter. But what is the problem? In females, it is going to open where? In females, this ectopic ureter, it is going to open into anterior urethra, means this is distal to external urinary sphincter. And if it is distal to external urinary sphincter, what will happen? Whatever the urine is formed from upper pole of the kidney, that urine will start going out via urethra. So what happens? Since birth, these patients have continuous dribbling of urine, and classically this is seen in females. So this female patient will come to you with history of continuous incontinence, that is known as continuous dribbling of urine, and simultaneously she will give you history that, sir, when my bladder is full, I go and pass urine. So this is normal voiding pattern. Why? Because of lower pole ureter and because of contralateral ureter. Clear? So this is classically seen in the patients of ectopic ureteric orifice. So correct answer for this question is C. Now see what's written in literature related to this condition. Now see what's written in Campbell. Continuous leakage in between normal voiding pattern in a girl should raise concerns of an ectopic ureter. See the second statement. A female who voids normally but who has dribbled urine as long as she can remember. It's a typical of ectopic ureter. Generally what happens, the females who are having ectopic ureteric orifice, this is associated with duplication. So generally what's the problem? There is incontinence. What kind of? Continuous incontinence, also known as constant dribbling, and there is normal voiding pattern. So these are the important points related to ectopic ureteric orifice, and this continuous incontinence or constant dribbling is exclusively seen in females. This is not seen in males. It's a repeat question, indirect repeat, because the almost same question was asked in NEET 2 years back. The clinical classification of CEAP. Okay, so 40 years old male, known case of varicose vein, came to OPD. See the findings. On examination, there is lipodermatosclerosis with eczema and blanching was present. It comes under, right? So what is CEAP classification? Let's see first. This CEAP classification is for chronic venous disorders. C means clinical, E means etiological, A means anatomical, and P means pathophysiological dysfunction. Clear? So this is CEAP classification. So let's see the clinical classification of CEAP classification for chronic venous disorder. If it is C0, it means there are no visible or palpable signs of venous disease. In C1, there is telangiectasia, reticular veins, or sometimes malleolar flare. If you can see that there is varicose vein, then it is C2, right? And with varicose vein, if there is edema, only edema, without skin changes, right, then it is C3. Whenever there are skin changes like lipodermatosclerosis, like pigmentation, venous eczema, so if these changes are there, it comes under C4, right? If with skin changes there is healed ulceration, it becomes C5, and if there is active ulceration, it becomes C6. Clear? So what is the correct answer here? Here the patient is having varicose vein with skin changes like eczema, lipodermatosclerosis. So correct answer for this question is D, and that is C4. Now see this question. Young male smoker came to OPD with history of intermittent claudication and pain to distal digits. So this patient is having peripheral arterial disease. Most probably patient is having Buerger's disease. Why? Patient is young male smoker with intermittent claudication. Okay. On examination, patient has painful ulcer at the tip of grade 2, surrounded by blackened skin. This is the classical location, one of the classical location of arterial ulcer. Best initial investigation in this case should be, now see what the question is asking, best initial investigation. It means the initial investigation should be cheap, should be safe, it should be non-invasive, and best means it should be accurate, close to angiography, right? So it should be cheap, safe, non-invasive, and accurate. That is the best initial investigation. And if the question is being asked, what is the gold standard investigation? So the gold standard investigation in this case would be angiography. So since the disease is confined to arteries, the gold standard investigation is angiography. But the best initial investigation, which is cheap, safe, non-invasive, and accurate, accuracy almost close to angiography. And what's that? That is duplex scan. So best initial investigation will be duplex scan. Now, why not digital subtraction angiography? Because this is invasive. And why not MR angio and CT angio? DSA, digital subtraction angiography. The name is digital subtraction angiography. So digitally means with the help of computer we are going to subtract the bone, soft tissue images so we can see the vessels. The image quality of DSA is better than MR angio or CT angio. So DSA is better, it is having better image quality as compared to MR angio or CT angio, right? So what is the best initial investigation in this case? It's duplex scan. Now see the literature. Now first see the sensitivity of duplex scan for arterial disorders, right? So duplex scanning is accurate for assessing arterial occlusive disease in patients suffering from claudication or critical ischemia, and see the sensitivity 80% and specificity 95%. So the patients who are having arterial occlusive disease suffering from claudication or ischemia, in the question what you saw, that patient was having intermittent claudication and there were ulcers at the tip of digits, right? Now contrast angiography remains the gold standard. So what is the best initial investigation? Duplex scan. Now see what's written in Bailey. In experienced hands, duplex scanning is as accurate as angiography, and the advantage, cost effectiveness and safety. So we discussed what is done in DSA. Whatever the extraneous background is there like bone, soft tissue, these are removed and we are going to get the clearer images, right? So here we can see the dynamic arterial flow information, and there is definitive endovascular intervention we can perform with DSA. CT angio, CTA and MR angio. These are the newer techniques, and if we are going to compare the image quality of CT angio and MR angio with DSA, these images are not as good. right? So when we are going for CT angio and MR angio, see what's written. They can be useful where duplex scanning is not possible. Like if we want to assess the intrathoracic arteries, right? Or if there is poor images of duplex scanning like aortoiliac segment. So for aortoiliac segment and for intrathoracic arteries, we can go for CT angio or MR angio. Otherwise, for peripheral arterial disease, generally the best initial investigation is what? Duplex scan, and the gold standard investigation is angiography. Now see this question, which of the following is correct related to the image given below? Okay, so what you see in this image, you can see that there is ulcer over the plantar aspect, and what you can see that this is the punched out ulcer, and you can notice that there is callosity in the periphery or in the surrounding. So surrounded by callosities. Okay, now generally these kind of ulcers are seen in the patients who are bedridden, or the patients who are diabetic, or the patients who are having some kind of peripheral neuropathy. So the name of this ulcer is trophic ulcer, also known as pressure ulcer, also known as penetrating ulcer or decubitus ulcer, right? So which of the following is correct related to this pressure ulcer? Peripheral neuropathy. So yes, the patients who are having peripheral neuropathy or neuritis, they can have pressure ulcer. Distal pulses not palpable. Generally, the patients in whom distal pulses are not palpable, these patients are having arterial ulcers. And we just discussed arterial ulcer generally. So location is ankles, foot and toes. Since the distal pulses are not palpable, so what are the other findings suggestive of arterial ulcer? There is punched out ulcer, and you will notice that there is loss of hair, signs of ischemia, loss of hair, there is shiny skin, brittle nails. So these findings are not there. So this is incorrect. Restriction in movement of toes. The patients who are having limited joint movement or contractures, even in those patients, we see or we find the pressure ulcers. So this is also correct. And diabetes mellitus, yes, it also leads to pressure ulcer. So out of these five, one is correct, three is correct, and four is correct. Clear? So what is the correct answer for this question? It is C. Pressure ulcer or pressure sore is very important topic. From the last 5 years, it is continuously being asked either in NEET or in JIPMER or in PGI or in AIIMS. So we are going to discuss in detail. So generally what happens in these patients, initially there is erythema, then there is tissue necrosis at a pressure point, and after that there is ischemia and necrosis. What is the problem in pressure ulcer? Because of external pressure, what? Because of external pressure, when the external pressure is going to exceed the capillary occlusive pressure, what? The blood flow to that part of skin stops, and because of that there is hypoxia. Because of hypoxia there is necrosis, and because of that there is ulceration. So this is the problem. The patients who are having malnutrition or poor glucose control, especially in diabetics, patient having paraplegia, quadriplegia who are confined to the beds or wheelchair, or a patient who are having muscle spasm or joint contractures. All of these are going to increase the risk of pressure sore. One of the important question which is asked about pressure ulcer is what is the most common site? The most common site is ischium, followed by greater trochanter, followed by sacrum, followed by heel, followed by malleolus, followed by occiput. Clear? So how to remember? IGSHMO. So it's Indira Gandhi Stadium, inauguration by Home Minister's Office. Clear? What are the neurological causes which are going to increase the risk of pressure ulcer? So it is syringomyelia, spina bifida, spinal injury, peripheral neuritis, peripheral neuropathy. You can see these kind of things in leprosy. Why? Because the nerves are affected. Diabetic neuropathy, paraplegia, and tape dorsalis. What kind of ulcer is seen? Punched out. And generally in these patients, since this is because of external pressure, so the base is formed by underlying bone. So in these cases, base is formed by bone. What is the question which is frequently asked about pressure sore or ulcer? It's the stage of pressure sore or ulcer. So there are four stages of this pressure ulcer, it's very easy to understand and remember. We are going to explain it from the first image only. So in stage 1, there is only erythema of skin. So this is stage 1. Clear? In stage 2, there is ulceration involving epidermis and dermis. So ulceration with involvement of epidermis and dermis. Whenever there is involvement of subcutaneous tissue also, and it is not extending to underlying fascia, involvement of subcutaneous tissue not extending to underlying fascia, then it becomes stage 3. And if it extends to underlying fascia, involves muscle, bone, then it becomes stage 4. I'm repeating. So in stage 1, there is no ulceration, only erythema of skin. So here you can see only erythema of skin. In stage 2, there is partial thickness skin loss involving epidermis plus dermis. So here you can see there is involvement of epidermis and dermis. In stage 3, there is full thickness skin loss with involvement of subcutaneous tissue, and it is not extending to underlying fascia. And if it is extending to underlying fascia involving muscle and bone, then it becomes stage 4. So what are the other names? Stage 1 is early superficial ulcer. Stage 2 is late superficial ulcer. Stage 3 is early deep ulcer, and stage 4 is late deep ulcer. How to remember? First, if there is no ulceration, it is stage 1. There is erythema, only skin is involved, it is stage 2. And if there is involvement of subcutaneous tissue also, it is stage 3. And if there is involvement of underlying structures like muscle and bone, this is stage 4. So these are the 4 stages, and this question was asked in NEET. Now see this question. This is also an easy question because you can solve this question again by principle of exclusion. 10 years old girl presented with growing left-sided neck swelling. So here you can see there is left-sided neck swelling. Simultaneously, what else you can see? That there are pigmented patches. Okay. Swelling was firm and non-tender. She had freckles and flat spots on the face and trunk. What is the most probable diagnosis? So if we see, yes, in cystic hygroma, in lipoma, and in chemodectoma, what freckles or flat spots are not seen. Cafe au lait spots are not seen. So cafe au lait spots are seen in neurofibromatosis, and this kind of swelling is just, it is a neurofibroma. Generally, neurofibromas are non-tender, slow-growing swelling. Clear? So by using this principle of exclusion, you can rule out. Okay. Now see, cystic hygroma. Most of the cystic hygroma are present at birth, and generally it is seen in anterior triangle of neck. Okay. What about lipoma? Lipoma is generally common at back in the trunk, and lipoma is having positive slip sign, but these kind of spots, freckles, these are not seen. And chemodectoma is also known as carotid body tumor. What is the classical location here? There is external carotid and internal carotid. Since it's a vascular swelling, it's a compressible swelling. Clear? So what is the correct answer in this case? Left-sided neck swelling, which is slow growing, non-tender, and there is freckles and flat spots. So it is seen in neurofibromatosis. Since neurofibromatosis is not there, so correct answer is neural tumor. So see how this cystic hygroma looks like, and this is the classical location of lipoma, and this is the appearance. It is having bossylated appearance. Here you can see the classical location of chemodectoma or carotid body tumor. Generally, you have seen patients of neurofibromatosis, and these patients have multiple soft rubbery cutaneous tumors, and these patients have cafe au lait spots and axillary freckling. How this neurofibroma looks like or manifest? Painless mass, and it is having slow growth, and this is generally benign. But what is the problem? In some patients, it can degenerate into malignant peripheral nerve sheath tumor. And what is the problem with this peripheral malignant nerve sheath tumor? That this is having high recurrence rate. Clear? So correct answer for this question was neurofibromatosis. Since it was not in the option, the correct option is neural tumor. Now see this question. A young male with head injury was brought to the emergency in unconscious state. So patient is in the unconscious state. Patient was not able to breathe properly, put on ventilatory support. So patient is unconscious, put on ventilatory support. GCS was 8 with findings of raised ICT. Right? So many findings are there. Patient is having head injury. And what we are going to find that NCCT brain and spinal imagings are normal. Right? So this is the classical description of diffuse axonal injury. What is diffuse axonal injury? There is injury to axons diffusely throughout the brain. This injury occurs. So the name is diffuse axonal injury. Generally what happens? There is rotational acceleration and deceleration, and because of that it is going to occur. What is the problem? Because of this diffuse axonal injury, when most of the patients are brought to the emergency, they are in the state of coma or in the state of unconscious state. So they are in unconscious state or in state of coma. And usually we are going to see that NCCT is normal. So how we are going to make the diagnosis of diffuse axonal injury? We are going to find multiple hemorrhages, and this is generally diagnosed on MRI. So if NCCT is normal, it's diagnosed on MRI. So this question was asked indirectly many times, in which a typical presentation of head injury, patient is in unconscious state, GCS is low, and CT is normal. So all these are suggestive of what? Diffuse axonal injury. So correct answer for this question is A. So what happens in this case? There is damage to axons throughout the brain, and it is because of rotational acceleration and then deceleration. And what we are going to find, there are small hemorrhages, and this is detected on MRI. Now because of this diffuse damages to the axons throughout the brain, the patients are in the state of coma or patients are unconscious at the time of presentation. CT often appears normal and the diagnosis is made on MRI. The prognosis of diffuse axonal injury is very, very poor. So again, this is a repeat question, straightforward question. Most common type of retroperitoneal sarcoma. So the most common type of retroperitoneal sarcoma is liposarcoma. Not only retroperitoneal sarcoma, overall most common type of soft tissue sarcoma is also liposarcoma, followed by leiomyosarcoma, right? So what is the most common type of retroperitoneal sarcoma? It is liposarcoma. So the questions are asked, what is the most common type of soft tissue sarcoma? See, it's wrongly written in Schwarz and Bailey. In Schwarz and Bailey, it's written what? Malignant fibrous histiocytoma. Correct answer is what? Liposarcoma. Okay. So most common type of soft tissue sarcoma is liposarcoma. It is correctly given in 11th edition of DVita and 20th edition of Subiston, followed by leiomyosarcoma, followed by synovial sarcoma, followed by malignant peripheral nerve sheath tumor, followed by malignant fibrous histiocytoma, followed by GIST, right? And if a question is asked, what is the most common type of pediatric soft tissue sarcoma? And that is rhabdomyosarcoma. Okay, we discussed that in soft tissue sarcoma, what is the most common route of spread? Hematogenous. And what is the most common site of metastasis? It is the lungs. Lymphatic spread is not seen in soft tissue sarcoma. There is a second question which is asked, that according to the type of sarcoma and location, so the type of sarcoma is going to vary depending upon the location. Most common type. So suppose a question is asked, what is the most common type of soft tissue sarcoma in extremities? So if a direct question is asked, most common type of soft tissue sarcoma in extremities, then it is malignant fibrous histiocytoma followed by liposarcoma. If it is asked in retroperitoneum, like in this question, so it is liposarcoma, and in GIT or in viscera, it is GIST, gastrointestinal stromal tumor. So these are the important points related to soft tissue sarcoma. Again, this is an indirect repeat because the similar question was asked in the NEET PG. Clear? Which of the following area apart from abdomen is included? E-fast. Fast and E-fast, these are very, very important topics asked frequently. We are going to discuss in detail. So first question, what is the full form of FAST? FAST is Focused Assessment with Sonography for Trauma. What is FAST? It's nothing. It's the ultrasound which is done very fast. So this FAST is performed within 2 to 4 minutes. So it is so fast, it is performed within 2 to 4 minutes. So how to remember 4 minutes, and what we are going to assess? We are going to assess 4 P's. What are those 4 P's? We are going to assess the pericardial sac region, perihepatic region, perisplenic region, and pelvis, right? And this is the sequence. In this sequence, this is assessed. So first, number 1, this is for pericardial sac. 2 is for perihepatic region. 3, it's for perisplenic region. And 4, this is for pelvic region. Another question which is asked frequently, that which view is used for pericardial sac? So here you can see we go for subxiphoid transverse view. And for perihepatic region, which view is used? Right upper quadrant longitudinal view. And for perisplenic region, left upper quadrant longitudinal view. For pelvis, we go for longitudinal and transverse view. Where exactly? In this suprapubic region. So for pelvis, it's the suprapubic longitudinal and transverse view. So how many views are there in FAST? 4 views. Then there is a question known as E-fast. So what is the full form of this E-fast? This is extended fast. So when fast is extended to assess left thoracic and right thoracic region, so if it is extended to assess the thoracic cavity, it is known as E-fast. So how many views are there in E-fast? There are 6 views. So this is 5th and this is 6th. What we are going to assess on E-fast? See, because of trauma, the changes occurring in the thoracic cavity. So we are going to assess or diagnose or rule out hemothorax or pneumothorax. So on E-fast, we assess the thoracic cavity, and this is done to rule out hemo or pneumothorax. Okay. So question, how much blood can be detected by E-fast? So at least there should be collection of more than 100 ml. You have to remember, this is very, very important point. So this E-fast is going to detect more than 100 ml blood in the thoracic cavity. Then one question which was asked in AIIMS, later repeated in NEET, that if a patient is having pneumothorax and you are going to perform E-fast, which sign is seen? This is known as stratosphere sign, also known as barcode sign. So in patients of pneumothorax, on E-fast, there is stratosphere sign, also known as barcode sign. So there is stratosphere or barcode sign. So these are important points related to FAST. You know, FAST is the first investigation done in patients of blunt trauma abdomen. What's the gold standard investigations in patients of blunt trauma abdomen who are stable? CCT. And you know, FAST has replaced the DPL. Clear? So correct answer for this question is A. By E-fast, we are going to assess what? Thoracic cavity. Now see this question. Again, a frequently asked question, and this question, similar question, is asked in each and every paper of AIIMS. From the last 5 years, this topic is asked in each and every paper of AIIMS. See, 25 years old patient of road traffic accident was brought to emergency after road traffic accident. Patient respiratory rate was 35 per minute. Okay, so respiratory rate was increased. Blood pressure was 100/60. With difficulty in speaking sentences. See the clue, difficulty in speaking sentences. There is hypotension, there is increased respiratory rate. On percussion, there was hyperresonance note on the entire right side of chest. So hyperresonance note was there. FAST was performed and it was normal. The chest x-ray, be careful, it is FAST, not E-fast. FAST means the 4 component, the 4 P's like pericardial sac, perihepatic region, perisplenic region and pelvis, these are normal, no fluid collection is there. Chest x-ray is given below. What is the next immediate step? So these are the findings. History of road traffic accident, patient is having increased respiratory rate, not able to speak sentences, there is zone of hyperresonance on the percussion, so there is collection of air on the right side of chest. And on x-ray what you can see here, the lung is collapsed, can you see? And there is presence of air. Here you can see the diaphragm is depressed and there is shift of mediastinum to opposite side. So all these are the findings which suggest the diagnosis of tension pneumothorax. You know, tension pneumothorax is an emergency. You should not send this patient for any kind of radiological investigation. On the basis of suspicion itself, we have to insert a wide bore needle in second intercostal space in mid-clavicular line. This was the traditional approach. But if you see the latest update of ATLS, and even in Schwartz 11th edition, the latest update says that we have to insert the wide bore needle in fifth intercostal space in anterior axillary line. In fifth intercostal space in adults. In children, it's same, second intercostal space. But in adults, wide bore needle should be inserted in the fifth intercostal space. Meanwhile, we are going to prepare ourselves for ICD insertion, intercostal drain insertion. So what is the definitive treatment? Is the chest tube insertion or ICD insertion in the triangle of safety. Clear? So this is the approach of management in patients of tension pneumothorax. So see the option. HRCT chest, no, don't send the patient for radiological investigation. Wide bore needle insertion in fifth intercostal space followed by ICD in fifth intercostal space, correct? Wide bore needle insertion in fifth intercostal space only. No, this is not the treatment of choice. This is just the emergency treatment. Immediately shift the patient to OT for thoracotomy. No, it's not the indication for thoracotomy. So what is the correct answer? The correct answer for this question is B, that we have to insert a wide bore needle in fifth intercostal space followed by chest tube or ICD insertion. Now see the ATLS updates. So according to ATLS update 2018, recent evidences support insertion of wide bore needle in fifth intercostal space slightly anterior to mid axillary line. Clear? Slightly anterior to mid axillary line. And this has been added in Schwartz also 11th edition, that recent studies suggest that preferred location for needle decompression may be fifth intercostal space in anterior axillary line due to body habitus. So you have to be very careful in exam. Suppose a child is going to develop tension pneumothorax. In that case, we have to insert the needle in second intercostal space only in mid-clavicular line. But in adults, it's the fifth intercostal space in anterior axillary line followed by insertion of chest tube. And where we insert the chest tube? In fifth intercostal space in the triangle of safety. Right, so this triangle of safety is also important. Here you can see generally it's the fifth intercostal space, and how we insert. Suppose this is the fifth rib, this is the sixth rib, so we have to insert the tube over the superior border of inferior rib. Why? Because inferiorly there is neurovascular bundle, right? And what are the boundaries? You can see anteriorly there is lateral border of pectoralis major, laterally there is latissimus dorsi, and inferiorly line passing from fifth intercostal space, and superiorly there is base of axilla. So this is triangle of safety where we insert the chest tube. Now see this question again. This is a repeat question. It was asked many times in AIIMS, in JIPMER, in NEET PG. Q SOFA. Which of the following are the components of Q SOFA? Q means quick, SOFA means sequential organ failure assessment. Clear? So there are three components. How to remember? It is QRS-MS. So Q means Q SOFA, R means respiratory rate, S means systolic blood pressure, MS means mental state alteration. Clear? So how to remember? It's QRS-MS, right? So respiratory rate more than equal to 22 per minute, systolic blood pressure less than equal to 100 mmHg, and there is mental state alteration, right? So what are included? Systolic blood pressure, respiratory rate, heart rate is not the component, neurological status or mental status. Clear? So 1, 2 and 4 are included. So correct answer for this question is B. Surgical positions are also asked commonly in exams. You have seen in surgery OT that most of the patients are placed in supine position. Supine position means patient is lying in the OT table and the back is flat. So this is supine position. Then there are two other common position. One is head low and one is head up. So head low position is known as Trendelenburg position. Trendelenburg position means when patient is placed supine, but what? The upper torso is made lower and the legs are raised. So this is what? Trendelenburg. And just opposite of Trendelenburg is what? Reverse Trendelenburg. In reverse Trendelenburg, what happens? The upper torso is raised and the leg is lowered. That is also known as head up. So simply how you can remember? Trendelenburg is head low and reverse Trendelenburg is head up position. See the question? So here you can see the upper torso of this patient is raised and the legs are lowered. Clear? So this is what? Reverse Trendelenburg position. In Trendelenburg, the upper torso is lowered and legs are raised. Clear? What is lithotomy position? Suppose you are going to place the patient in supine position, right? So after placing the supine position, the legs are raised, secured and arms are extended. So see the various position here. In supine position, you notice that patient is lying in the OT table and the back is flat. Clear? Trendelenburg, here initially patient is placed in supine position. Can you see the upper torso is lowered and legs are raised. Clear? So this is known as head low position. Reverse Trendelenburg in question, upper torso is raised, leg is lowered. What happens in Fowler's position? Initially the patient is lying down in supine position. Slowly we are going to raise the upper torso to 90 degree. So this is Fowler's position. And you can see this position. This is lithotomy position. In gynecological surgeries, in urological procedures, the patient is generally placed in this. And whenever we are performing the anal procedures, like if we are performing hemorrhoidectomy, if we are performing the operation for fissure, the patient is put in this lithotomy position. So here you can see the upper torso is just like supine position, but the legs are raised and these legs are secured. And here you can see the arm is extended. Clear? So this is lithotomy position. Okay. Lithotomy, initially this position was used for cutting the bladder stone or removing the bladder stone. So litho means stone, tomy means cutting, right? Now this position is used for gynecological surgeries, used for anal procedures, and it is used for urological procedures. Clear? So this is lithotomy position. Now see this question. Similar questions were asked many times in AIIMS, like color coding of cannula, color coding of Foley's catheter, right? So what is the gauge of given cannula? And this is pink cannula. It is 20 gauge. So see the questions related to the cannulas. So here you can see this is orange and this is of 14 gauge. And how much is the flow rate? 240 ml per minute. You have to remember the flow rates also, because nowadays they are asking flow rates. This is gray and gray is of 16 gauge. And how much is the flow rate? 180 ml per minute. This is green. For most of the resuscitations in surgery, generally we use green. So 18 gauge for green. And how much is the flow rate? It's 90 ml per minute. This is the pink cannula and we discussed it's of 20 gauge. And how much is the flow rate? 60. Right? This is blue and it's of 22 gauge. And how much is the flow rate? 36 ml per minute. Then there is yellow. Yellow is of 24 gauge and the flow rate is 20 ml per minute. And this one is violet. It's of 26 gauge and how much is the flow rate? 13 ml per minute. So this is very important topic. Most of the times they are asking this question, and sometimes image based questions are also asked. So again, an easy question. What are the nerves injured in which surgery? So generally this external laryngeal nerve, this is external laryngeal or external branch of superior laryngeal nerve. This is most commonly injured nerve in thyroidectomy. So 1D, thyroidectomy. Long thoracic nerve and thoracodorsal nerve. Okay, long thoracic supply serratus anterior. So this long thoracic and thoracodorsal nerve, these are the nerves which are injured during mastectomy or modified radical mastectomy. So 2C, phrenic nerve. The phrenic nerve is generally sacrificed in advanced thymoma. What happens whenever the thymoma is advanced, locally advanced, and it is invading the phrenic nerve? In some cases we have to sacrifice the phrenic nerve, and in certain cases it is injured. So phrenic nerve is injured in thymectomy. So for 3 it's B, video assisted thymectomy. And you know, hypoglossal nerve, there are 3 nerves. One, lingual nerve, hypoglossal, and marginal mandibular nerve. Okay, so these nerves are injured in submandibular gland excision. So for 4 it is A. So this is 1D, 2C, 3B, 4A. 1D, 2C, 3B, 4A. So correct answer for this question is A. So let's see the list of important nerves which are injured during particular surgery. So you know, whenever we perform superficial parotidectomy, which nerve is injured? Certain branches of facial nerve. So in superficial parotidectomy, facial nerve. Whenever we are performing carotid endarterectomy, again we are going to injure what? Hypoglossal nerve. In thyroidectomy, there are increased risk of injury to which nerve? External branch of superior laryngeal and a recurrent laryngeal. And a question is asked, out of these two, which one is the most commonly injured nerve? Is external laryngeal or external branch of superior laryngeal nerve. In prostatectomy, we are going to injure nervi irrigantis. That's why it leads to impotence. In hernia surgeries, ilioinguinal nerve is injured. In mastectomy, we discussed long thoracic nerve and thoracodorsal. In thymectomy, phrenic nerve. During submandibular gland excision, what happens? Submandibular. So which nerve? Marginal mandibular branch of facial nerve, lingual and hypoglossal. So this is very, very important table. You have to remember. So see this question, match the following. In column A, if you see 1, what happens? Here is the clamp. And here you can see this is the water seal. So via this we fill the saline or water. And this is connected to the chest tube. So this is underwater seal. Patients who are having pneumothorax and hemothorax, we are going to insert the chest tube. So whatever the air or blood is collected, that comes out and it is collected here. So this is underwater seal connected to the chest tube. If you see this second one, here this is the uro bag. So in the ward you have seen that it is connected to Foley's catheter for draining the urine. This third is Ryle's tube. So what is the use? Generally we use this for decompression in surgery. And if you see this fourth one, this is the suction tube. So for oral or nasal suction, you have seen that in ICUs, in OT, we have to perform the suctioning. So this is the suction tube. Clear? So this one is underwater seal. So 1 is D. 2 is urobag. So 2C. 3 is Ryle's tube used for gastric decompression. So 3B. And 4 is what? Oral and nasal suction tube. Clear? So 4 is A. So 1D, 2C, 3B, 4A. Clear? So the correct answer for this question is C. Now another easy question. Generally we follow these steps. So in the following conditions, sanitizer can be used. So whenever we are going to examine the patient, first we have to use the sanitizer. After examining the patient, again you have to use the sanitizer. After touching the patient's surroundings, we use sanitizer. And when our hands are soiled, after washing our hands, we have to use the sanitizer. So in the following conditions, sanitizer can be used. So in all 4 conditions, we are going to use sanitizer. 1, 2, 3, 4. So correct answer for this question is D. So these are the surgery questions of INI CET. So what you noticed, that the paper was totally predictable and more than 80% questions were repeat questions direct repeats or indirect repeats. Let me tell you, before paper, lots of students were calling me, sending me messages that sir, in prospectus the pattern is not revealed. So what we can expect? Let me tell you, it doesn't matter which exam you are going to appear for. Generally, they have follow a set pattern. Means you have to focus about the 80% of important topics, right? And majority of topics are asked directly or indirectly related to those topics only. So INICET is over, results are declared. Even if you didn't get a good rank, what you have a golden opportunity. The golden opportunity is that NEET exam is postponed. So rather than wasting your time, see the exam is in the month of March end or April. So you have 3 extra months for preparation, for revision. So it's a golden opportunity for all of us. So put your 100% into the preparation, into the revision. Don't just procrastinate. Don't just waste time in speculating that when the exam dates will be announced, whether we should be started studying or not, what will be the pattern. Let me tell you, the questions will be those important topics which are asked everywhere. So you have to put your 100% into the preparation. This book will be highly helpful because you have to revise the previous year questions asked in NEET to see what kind of questions, what kind of topics are asked in the exam. So convert this obstacle into opportunity. Good luck for NEET PG 2021.